Welcome to this brief R tutorial on browsing data. In the last few videos we've talked a lot about how to get data into R, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about some first things to do when you've loaded a data set into R that you're interested in doing something with, examining, summarizing, whatever. So we're going to talk quickly about 5 commands that turn out to be incredibly useful. I use these almost every time I sit down to do analysis. So we're going to talk about the dim command, which is going to be useful for telling us how many observations we have in our data set. The head command is going to be really great for letting us look at just the beginning of the data set. The question mark command is awfully useful for a number of tasks, but when we're interested in getting a feel for our data, that's going to bring up any documentation that is closely associated with the data set, if it exists. And then the names and summary commands are going to be useful for figuring out what variables are in our data set and for giving us some quick statistical summaries of those variables. So let's bring up R, and in order to demonstrate some of this, I'm going to load the iris dataset. So when I run this data iris command, I can see right away some information about the dataset already. We've talked about this in earlier videos. Now, this tells me that there are 150 observations and 5 variables. Now, the dim command is just another way of getting that same information. That asks R to report back the dimensions of the data frame where variables are, or data are stored. So if I said dim and then the name of the data set, R would tell me back 150 by 5. So it's a little bit redundant, but incredibly useful. Now the head command is really great as well. So this is something that you're going to want to run when you first load data into the program. And executing this allows you to look at all of the variables in the data set for the first 6 observations. If you want to see more than just 6, you can increase the number to something else, say 10 here, and that'll show you the first n observations that you type in here. Now this is going to be really nice for making sure that data have loaded properly. It's just kind of a quick visual inspection is often really useful on this front. Now, oftentimes when we're working with data sets, other people have worked hard in order to collect information about that data set somewhere. So the question mark command is going to be awfully useful for uncovering and identifying that documentation. So for the iris data set, for example, which is built into R, I can just type question mark and then iris, again the name of the data set, and when I execute this command, over here in the help files, I get some quick documentation on this data set. So I can see this short description right here. There's some information about the formatting, so it says again there are 150 cases and 5 variables. And then some documentation will provide a summary of the variables that are available. Here we just see what their names are, but we don't know too much about how those variables are measured, etc. And documentation is really going to vary. A lot of the projects that you work on will not have any sort of published data dictionary or documentation immediately available, but it's often worth kind of checking to see what's there with that question mark command. Now, another way of recovering information about these data frames where the data are stored. The data frame is just the name for the kind of object that R is using. I'm going to use the names command. So when I say names iris, I get a vector, which is just sort of a short list of each of the variable names in my data set. So you can see here, if I expand the console a bit, that the first column has this title which is sepal length. The second column is sepal width. So sometimes it's useful just to get a quick list of the variable names that are there. And for some data sets, you're going to have many more variables than you can quickly look at just on the screen. So for example, if I load the plyr package and then load the baseball data set, I see there are actually 22 variables here. So if I chose this strategy of just looking at the data, which I probably should do at the beginning to make sure it loads correctly, we see that the variables actually spill onto another row here. And so sometimes it's easier just to ask R to report the names of the data set, names baseball, in a vector like this, so we can kind of see them all in one place. Now, the last thing that's really useful when you're very first loading a data set is the summary command. So you can do this, or you can apply the command to either the entire data set or a specific variable. So again, returning to this iris data set, I can say summary iris, and this is going to give me a summary of each of the variables. Now, the kind of summary that I get back is going to depend a bit on the type of data that is collected. So if I scroll back up to the iris data set, you'll notice that the species is actually a name here. The species doesn't vary for any of these first observations, but it turns out that there are 3 different kinds of flowers in this data set. The sepal length, sepal width, these other variables as well, are going to be quantitative rather than categorical. Now, this is a distinction that we're going to talk about more throughout the course, but the important bit here is that the summary command will give you different kinds of statistics depending on what sort of variable you're talking about. So for those quantitative measures, we see what the minimal observation value is, the max, and we get some other nice kind of summary statistics here, so the median, mean, etc. For categorical variables, we get a summary of how many observations are in each level. So we know that there are 50 observations for this Setosa type, 50 observations for this versicolor type, etc. So these 5 commands, let me just bring up my slide here. These 5 commands are going to be incredibly useful for getting kind of a rough sense of what's in your data when you first look at it. You're going to want to know how many observations you have and on which variables. Looking at the data to make sure that it loads correctly is always a good practice. The question mark command is good for identifying documentation, kind of browsing through. And then the names command is good for figuring out which variables are present. And then the summary command is good for getting kind of a quick, rough feel of how your data are distributed.